This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from Katowice, Poland, from the UN climate talks, from a convention center that's built to look like a coal mine. In fact, it's on the property of an old coal mine. We're about an hour from Krakow and about the same distance from Auschwitz, the World War II Nazi concentration camp where close to 1 million Jews died. I'm Amy Goodman. We continue our look today at how the United States and the world's other worst emitters are hindering negotiations here at the UN Climate Summit in Poland. Even as countries from the global south warn they can face annihilation without drastic action to confront climate change. Still with us for part two of our discussion is Singh, the global lead on climate change for ActionAid. He's been working with climate migrants in a number of countries, based himself in New Delhi, India. It's great to continue to speak to you, Harjeet. Why don't you talk about, we ended part one talking about the scope of the problem. And if you could lay out the effects of climate change, and then I want to focus on climate migrants.
So in developing countries, we are seeing how livelihoods are being impacted. People are losing their homes, and they have no option left but to leave their homes and families behind. When we talk about displacement or climate migration, it clearly means that the local coping mechanisms have failed. Climate displacement is the epitome of climate impacts. Nobody would like to leave their homes and families behind. And we are seeing impacts rising, be it sea level rise, increasing number of hurricanes, their intensity is increasing. We are facing unprecedented droughts, and people do not have really the capacity to cope. By the time they try to recover from the previous shock, another one hits them and hits them harder. And poor countries do not have resources to provide them relief, to help them reconstruct their homes and rebuild their lives. And when it comes to UNFCCC negotiations, the discussion on finance is so difficult. It's not moving forward. And at this moment, when the rule book is being developed, the discussion is around predictability of finance and accounting. In 2016, developed countries came up with a report saying we are on track to provide $100 billion, but the report was full of cooked up numbers and dodgy methodology to count the money. And
how do you answer people in the United States, certainly the Trump administration, who might say, why help other countries? We have to, well, he's talking about America first.
Let us understand who has caused this problem. It's 150 plus years of industrialization, and the US and other bigger countries in the West have actually enjoyed the fruits of that industrialization, which has caused pollution. And this pollution is responsible for global warming and climate change. And developing countries who are not responsible for the crisis are facing these disasters. So it's an ecological debt that US and other countries have to pay. And to understand the emissions that have been put, US is responsible for 1/4 of emissions historically, and same with European Union. So they have to put money on the table. This is the least that they can do to help people who are suffering from impact for no cause of theirs.
So let's go to this issue of climate migrants. ActionAid spoke to climate migrants, your organization, in Bangladesh. Let's go to some of those voices.
I couldn't eat a single grain of rice because I was in such a traumatic state. My most painful memory was when I gave my house to the person I borrowed money from. If I can work hard enough to save money for a house, even if it takes 10 years, then I will do it. Who would ever willingly want to leave their hometown to move to Dhaka?
When the flooding happens, we leave our homes and go to the cyclone center. But it's not possible to take it all.
Water levels are rising day by day. They, Piara's family, went to Dhaka because they weren't even earning enough to feed themselves. I don't want to be compelled to go to Dhaka. We would like support so that ultimately we can support ourselves independently in our hometown.
My land and housing have been destroyed. Every year there's a flooding. How many disasters can one tolerate year after year?
There you have some climate migrants from Bangladesh speaking with ActionAid. Our guest, Singh, global lead on climate change and ActionAid. The U.S. Pentagon, even if President Trump denies climate change, calling it a Chinese hoax, the Pentagon full well understands the pressure of climate change and has talked about it being the driver of war in the 21st century. Explain how that can be, from Bangladesh to other countries around the world, even the migrant caravans in Latin America making their way north, the discussions of drought and what people are fleeing, even drought as a pressure in Syria.
Absolutely. So what we saw as Syrian crisis was a preview of what's going to happen in the next few decades. When people have no option, they have no food, their houses get washed away, and they have nowhere to go. What else they do? They leave their homes. They first go to bigger cities, then they go to capitals, and when they have no opportunity there, they also cross borders. So even if that is a fraction of number, that number is going to rise, and we have no protection mechanism for them. So it's very clear that the scale of migration that we are going to see caused by climate change is going to increase several folds. And this is only when we are living in a 1 degree warmer world. It's very important to recognize that. The impacts at 1.5 degree, 2 degree are going to be several folds. And at this moment, the current level of emissions, we are moving towards a 3 degree warmer world. It's going to be devastating for them, and when they have no option, they will put their lives in danger and cross borders.
Explain what this UN science report means, even with the U.S. joining with Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Kuwait, and saying they won't welcome the report, they'll simply note it. This Nobel Peace Prize winning scientific body of the United Nations saying that we've got 12 years when it comes to climate change before catastrophe occurs. What does that mean?
It means that we now have to bring the discussion of limited carbon budget right at the center. At UNFCCC climate talks, they have long avoided what is that cake looks like, cake of carbon budget, how much we can more emit so that we don't go beyond 1.5 degree temperature threshold, and how to cut the cake, which is technically known as equity. Now, they call this equity discussions very toxic because that's where responsibilities are fixed. We know that this cake of responsibility is largely belongs to developed countries. They now have to cut the cake, which means they have to put their plans on the table, how much emission reduction I'm going to do in my own respective country, and how much money I'm going to provide to developing countries so that they can also reduce emissions.
I mean, this term climate equity is so important.
Absolutely. And we have avoided even at climate talks. But look at what climate science says. It has clearly put 12 years deadline in front of us. And we have to bring the emissions down by half by 2050. And that's
the kind. They've increased.
Exactly. And the emissions are going up. And this year it's all projected that the emissions are going to go up. It's going to be the highest level of emissions ever we have seen. So we are not going in the right direction. Here at Katowice, that's why it's so important to make sure that the rule book is robust. It talks about ambition, but it also enables ambition by providing finance to developing countries.
So talk about the U.S. spokesperson who said at the only side panel the U.S. is hosting, where they push fossil fuels and coal, and nuclear power. He said that they are trying to ensure a level playing field. Last year, the same thing said as they talked about increasing the visibility of fossil fuels and coal. This year, the State Department saying ensuring a level playing field that benefits and protects U.S. interests. Would you argue it's actually in U.S. interests to deal with climate change?
A level playing field for whom? For fossil fuel companies that are responsible for causing the crisis? And U.S. and other developed countries like Saudi Arabia are protecting the interest of these fossil fuel companies. They have much more power than developing countries and people who are facing climate impact. And it's not even in U.S. favor. We have seen fires in California. We have seen Hurricane Harvey. So even U.S. citizens' life is at stake. So we need to put pressure on the government. So it's not just about developing countries. As we say, climate change knows no borders. Everybody is going to get affected. But what is important to recognize that it's developing countries. One, they are not responsible for the problem. Second, they don't have resources to deal with it. And third, there's also an opportunity for that they adopt a much greener development pathway.
So let's talk about another phrase that's UN lingo, but is so much more than that when it comes to the devastation on the ground, and that's the term loss and damage. I wanted to turn to the Environment Minister of the Maldives, speaking Tuesday about financing for the developing countries most vulnerable to the adverse impacts of climate change.
We continue to be very concerned by what appears to be deliberate attempts to isolate loss and damage in the negotiations. Loss and damage is an undeniable part of our reality today and must be reflected by incorporating it into the transparency framework, global stocktake and finance. We need to identify how finance flows, both public and private, reflects the 1.5-degree goal and are reaching those who need support the most, especially small island developing states and the least developed countries.
That's the Environment Minister of the Maldives speaking Tuesday. Top representatives of countries from all over the world are in one plenary, each one addressing the world about climate change. Our guest is Harjeet Singh, because there are also thousands of activists from around the world. He is from India, New Delhi to be exact, global lead on climate change at Action Aid. If you could elaborate on what the Environment Minister said from the specific island nation of Maldives.
So let me put things into context. When we talk about climate action, there are three pillars of climate action. One is mitigation, which is about emission reduction and protecting forest. Second is about adaptation, which means being much more prepared to deal with climate impact so that we are not impacted, which means retrofitting your houses, building dikes, making sure that your agriculture is climate resilient. The third aspect is what happens when you are already getting affected. That's the loss and damage. That has become a third pillar of climate action. And we fought very hard in Paris to make sure that it is separated from adaptation and has its own article. So Article 8 of the Paris Agreement is about loss and damage. Now, this is where it has become a lot more contentious at Katowice. We would like to have global stocktake, which is a ratchet-up mechanism every 5 years, to have focus on all three aspects in addition to financing. Developed countries, particularly US, Australia, Canada, Japan, are resisting to have this language included in the global stocktake. Now, it is fundamental for Pacific nations and all developing countries, because if you don't have that element, then in every 5 years, you will not be talking of people. We'll only be talking of solar panels, we'll be talking of wind farms, we'll be talking of, are we doing something to prepare for climate impacts, but not about people who are already getting impacted. We are living in a situation where many people are going to be relocated because the place are either going to be swallowed by sea or going to be unairable. What would happen to such people? We need to have a mechanism in place so that we can deal with loss and damage.
Do you see a connection between the pressures of climate change and the massive exodus of climate refugees and right-wing governments, authoritarian governments, erecting walls, for example, in Hungary, or the President of the United States on the southern border is threatening to shut down the U.S. government if he doesn't get financing for his wall? Do you see a connection between authoritarian governments' rise and the pressures of refugees trying to leave plagued areas?
Yes, there is connection, but what we need to understand that things are going to get much worse if we don't act now. Nobody would like to leave her or his home because they're not getting greener pastures. They are going to live they're putting their life in danger while in transit, and they're living in very insecure environment, with a lot of uncertainty. So it's not that everybody is willing to come to Europe or the United States. People would like to remain there, while we also recognize that mobility is a fundamental right recognized by the UN. So we have to put systems in place that we are not forcing people and driving people away from their homes. That's why discussions here are far more important, to make sure that there is money on the table and we are ready to help people who are being forced to migrate.
You say this is the most important summit since the Paris Accord was signed?
So in Paris, we had an agreement, and now it's about operationalizing the agreement by having a robust rule book in place. If that doesn't happen, where are the rules to make sure that Paris Agreement is implemented in toto?
What does stringent reporting mean, Harjeet?
See, the kind of plans countries have put on the table are of a different nature. Some are talking about reducing carbon intensity. Some are talking about absolute reductions in different sectors like transport, energy. Some are talking about economy-wide emission reduction. So there are going to be different metrics. So we need to have a system in place so that we are able to understand where we are heading in terms of emissions and emission reduction patterns. For that, you need to have a reporting system. But let's also understand that not all countries have same level of technical institutions to capture that information and do reporting periodically, which means we have to have some flexibility and support built in making sure that the report is coming and it's true and we are able to get a good sense of what's going on. Now, that comes under the whole transparency system, and United States is pushing very hard on transparency when it comes to reporting, but there is another side to it. It's about transparency of finance and support. The moment you talk about transparency of finance, things get stuck. There is no movement on how money is going to be provided to developing countries to transition to greener pathways and tackle climate impacts. Now, that's where things are stuck as we speak.
Finally, your assessment of where things are right now at this climate summit and what you want to see happen by the end of the week.
Very clearly, we have to see progress on finance. So there are two aspects. One is predictability, which means developing countries should know how much money is coming and when, and in what form and shape. And second, that we should be able to account for that money. We have seen examples of loans and guarantees being included because of that dodgy methodology. If the money is real, the action is going to be real. So once we are able to have money on the table, it will unlock ambition, and that will keep us below 1.5 degree temperature rise scenario, and we have very little time, just 12 years to bend the curve. At the same time, we also need to help people who are already getting affected from climate change, both preparing them for impacts and people who are already affected, we need to help them rebuild their lives. So money is central, whatever we are doing here.
And last question, where you come from, in New Delhi, India, what are the effects of climate change? What does climate change look like?
We have seen unprecedented drought. We have seen floods in Kerala, the southern part of India. It happened after 100 years. And Kerala is one of the prosperous states with good capacity to deal with disasters, and just didn't know how to deal with it because of the scale of the problem, scale of the disaster. So even a country like India, which has some resources, is unable to deal with the increasing number of hurricanes, floods, drought, and also sea level rise. So imagine what would happen to a small developing country like Malawi or Nepal. And that's the most concerning situation. On one hand, we are failing on reducing emissions, and on the other hand, we are not ready to help people who are already getting affected. So we have to make progress on all these aspects to make sure that we implement the Paris Agreement in letter and spirit.
I want to thank you for being with us. Harjeet Singh, global lead on climate change at Action Aid, working with climate migrants in a number of countries, based in New Delhi, India. To see part one of our discussion with him, go to democracynow.org. And also to see all of our coverage from Katowice, Poland, where we are right now, broadcasting for the week from the UN Climate Summit. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.